Good afternoon and welcome back, everyone. My name is Lizzy McEntire and I'm the Senior Articles Editor of the Washburn Law Journal. Today, I have the privilege of introducing this year's keynote, Professor Jennifer Taub from Western New England University School of Law. Her keynote address is entitled "Home is Where I Want to Be." Professor Taub is a legal scholar and advocate devoted to making complex business law topics engaging inside and outside of her classroom. Professor Taub's research and writing focuses on corporate governance, banking and financial market regulation, as well as white-collar crime. Similarly, her advocacy centers on follow the money matters, promoting transparency and opposing corruption. Professor Taub has written extensively on the 2008 mortgage meltdown and financial crisis. Her book, Other People's House, was published in 2014, which focuses on the area of banking and financial marketing regulations. Also, Professor Taub's book, Big Dirty Money, which I believe Professor Boyack was showing off, was published in 2020. Professor Taub holds a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a JD from Harvard. She received many awards and accolades throughout her career. However, one of the most recent ones is the Women's Law Association Phenomenal Women's Award through Vermont Law School. Most recently, Professor Taub was elected to the American Law Institute to clarify and otherwise improve the law. And without further ado, Professor Taub, I will turn it over to you and hopefully you have enough internet for your keynote.
Thank you so much, Lizzy. Yes, I'm using my cellular service on my phone and it's now plugged in here, so I'm not homeless. I'm actually in my office. So thank you, Lizzy. Thank you to the entire Washburn Law Journal team for this invitation to speak today. Thank you, of course, to Professor Boyack and also Sean Leisinger. I also want to thank my esteemed panelists, those at the panel this morning, and those in the afternoon talking about, later today, talking about equal opportunity. Disclaimer, I'm not usually self-deprecating, but I feel I must be. While the other experts speaking today are truly well-versed in many facets of housing law and holistically speaking about housing, discrimination, access, as well as equal opportunity, I am someone who merely dabbles in various areas of law that relate to income and wealth inequality, everything from housing to investments to the criminal justice system. And my emphasis tends to be on the ways in which the systems they structure give a special edge to the wealthy or disadvantage the rest of us, and not just the so-called, as the panel talked about earlier, not just the deserving poor, but the middle class as well. Now, a few words on the title of my talk. It is Home is Where I Want to Be. Those of you who are old enough to remember the band, the Talking Heads, may recognize that refrain. People think that's the name of the song, but the song is actually called Naive Melody. And I intentionally am talking about what I'm about to say as perhaps a naive melody, because I remain hopeful that we can get housing right if we're willing to deal with the existing narratives and not just the legal mechanics. But again, perhaps I am naive. In terms of specific topics, this talk is designed to kind of walk through three different periods of time when housing policy, either at the federal, state, or local level, or both, worked in ways that to help individuals facing loss of homes or homelessness. But what these all share in common is a triggering event, an emergency. I'm not going to call it an act of God or force majeure, because those are too much contractual concepts, but I mean some kind of perceived external shock, which loosened up the public and policymakers' sense that it was time for an intervention in the broken markets. Before I begin, I'm not claiming any of these interventions were perfect, and as you will see, some of them actually failed to come to fruition. And I will note that. I'm just suggesting that there seems to be the ability to deal with housing and homelessness if there is an emergency. Without hiding the ball, what I'm positing is the status quo is an emergency. And if we must emphasize the data around that. And this includes the fact that more than 552,000 people are homeless right now, and that's just who we know about. The majority of those homeless people are located in California, most populous state, but in terms of per capita, it turns out that Washington, D.C. has the highest homelessness rate with 90 people per 10,000 without homes. I think it's disgraceful, and I think it's complicated, and it's a multifaceted problem. And when I get to the toward the end of the talk, we'll talk about that. Okay, so what are the periods of history I want to talk about? Briefly about after the Great Depression, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, which has already been discussed briefly today. Also, the efforts to help millions of homeowners save their homes after the 2008/2009 financial meltdown and mortgage crisis. And then also the response during the COVID pandemic, which is still ongoing, that involves mortgage payment deferrals, or known as forbearance, and also efforts at the federal, state, and local level to help stop renters from being evicted. And then a few more things after that. So just starting with, and by the way, I want to make clear that I understand I'm speaking to an audience, some of whom probably know all of this, but I'm also guessing that there are some students here, and maybe Professor Boyack can nod her head, that maybe are not as much aware of some of these details unless they have learned all of them in her courses. So bear with me if this is something you already know. But with the New Deal, FDR and the Congress that seemed to be following his wishes and whims, created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and that was in 1933. And HOLC was an agency that had nearly 20,000 employees. And one of the things it did was to purchase defaulted mortgages. And the way they did this is HOLC paid the lenders on these mortgages with US government insured bonds. So just exchanging a piece of paper and a promise to pay. And they paid the lenders less than the principal outstanding on the loans, though. So these were purchased not for full principal value. And then it worked with the homeowners who were affected to refinance their mortgages so they would avoid foreclosure. And HOLC engaged in lending for just a few years, stopped lending in 1936. But over that time period, HOLC refinanced more than 1 million mortgages. And that was at the time 20% of all mortgage loans in the country. And of course, some people still redefaulted, but 80% of the owners were able to save their homes. It also provided liquidity for banks and thrifts, because these pieces of the Treasury paper then could be used to borrow against. It was a good asset. And 15 years after HOLC actually refinanced its last mortgage, it dissolved with a $14 million surplus to the government. Now, we know there are issues with FDR's program, not just HOLC, but also the FHA. We know that these interventions were selectively applied. We know the story of redlining and so on. I am not trying to minimize the problems in how this was allocated, how the aid was distributed. I'm suggesting we do things on a fair and inclusive basis and learn from those mistakes, but also learn from what works. Okay, let's fast forward to 2008 and 2009. After the financial crash in December of, or actually I should say after Lehman crash in September 15th, 2008, many folks may remember there was an immediate concern that because the banks were failing because they were weighed down by toxic mortgage-backed securities, or toxic mortgage-linked securities. Not all of them were directly backed by that, but the banks were gonna fail. But a lot of people, in the news and in policy circles, were focused so much on saving the banks, but there are plenty of us who are actually concerned about the homeowners who were living in the homes, who were, whose home values were falling, and many who were defaulting in the millions, and we were worried about them losing their homes. And there was immediately a concern that the so-called bailouts and the other government supports, not just from Congress, but through the Fed and other apparatuses, would only do a top-down rescue, and we would leave everybody else to suffer. So one of the efforts that was underway right away in late 2008 and carried into 2009 was dealing with the situation where there were homeowners who were underwater. And what many of you know is to be underwater on your mortgage means that you owe more in the outstanding balance on your loan than the now sunken value of your home. And on its own, if you can keep making the payments on your mortgage, that doesn't necessarily affect you, right? It would just mean you just keep making your payments. And then if you ever want to sell your house, hopefully it's appreciated in value. But if you keep making your payments, eventually you pay off your debt. The problem, though, is that wasn't everybody's situation. There were some people who had certain kind of home loans that were interest only, and other very unusual loan structures, but some that were variable rate interest only loans. So they were kind of paying their mortgage debt like you might pay a credit card. And the problem was there were teaser rates, and they only had to pay a small amount every month, and they could keep paying that small amount. But then there was going to be a payment shock that could happen. And a lot of the payment shocks were kind of baked into the system to happen 2007, 2008, 2009, depending on when you took out your loan. And the payment shock would mean, instead of paying this little interest only piece, you would now have to pay a chunk of the principal that you owed, and you wouldn't be able to. So there are a lot of different things happening where it's not true that everybody could pay their mortgage. The other thing that's true is because our economy at that time was heavily dependent on people cashing out some of the equity in their home, and people weren't going to be doing that anymore. And this whole thing starts to unravel when there's not enough demand in the economy and so on. Anyway, I'm just giving you kind of a picture of what's happening at the time. People were, so again, not a complete solution to helping various homeowners, but there was a desire to help millions of people whose homes were underwater find a way that they could, it can be called cram down or principal reduction, so that if they owed $300,000 on their mortgage, but the home was only worth 200, they could get the restructuring so that they would only owe 200,000. And instead of, the desire was not to actually see if any individual homeowner could negotiate on that on their own, which would have been very difficult, but to use a system that's been in place that businesses use for restructuring debt when they're in crisis, which is the bankruptcy system. But there was one obstacle that stood in the way at the time, which was a Supreme Court case decided in 1993 called Nobleman versus American Savings Bank. And this is the moment where I'm going to read to you to give you the context. Oh, let me back up a little bit more. So the House had passed some legislation to reform, to create a statute that would allow, again, people to use bankruptcy to reduce principal on their homes in a kind of bankruptcy restructuring situation, Chapter 13. And this had, and it wasn't perfect. It didn't apply to, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute, but it was better than nothing. And it was pretty good could affect a large number of homeowners whose homes were underwater. It would have helped them individually stay in their homes, but it could also have helped the economy more broadly. Okay, so something like this had passed the House, and then we get to April of 2009. And I'm going to read you two different passages from my book, Other People's Houses, about the mortgage crisis, because I think that captures very well what was going on in the floor of the Senate, but more importantly, what was going on in households across the country, and how it was actually not just a matter of policy at the Washington level, but that newsmakers and pundits were able to stoke our sense of jealousy and envy. And that's why, again, I talked about narratives. That's why it's sometimes the place we need to work, not just on the legal mechanics, but on letting people understand what an emergency was. Because even though this was clearly an emergency, the collapse of the financial system, there's always someone who says, hey, I'm not hurt. Why should anyone be helped? I know that sounds very selfish, but it is actually not understanding that we are all interconnected together. That makes people think, you're sitting in the same boat with someone else, and there's the boat is leaking, helping bail them out is actually going to help you from sinking. But that's not how people think. And until they do, I think we're going to be struggling with this issue. Okay, so let me begin. And I promise, am I still good on time, Andrea? I think I am. Okay, good. So this is a subsection of a chapter called The Great Betrayal of Other People's Houses. And this subsection is called The Moment of Truth. Okay, 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm scrolling and I just, shoot. I'm sorry. A few minutes past 11 a.m. on April 30th, 2009, Illinois Senator Richard Durbin lifted a poster off the carpeted Senate floor, placed it on a wooden easel, and began speaking. The poster showed a giant photograph of two neighboring houses. On the left was a boarded up property. On the right, a well-maintained home. Durbin explained that the value of the occupied residence was threatened by the foreclosed, vandalized space next door. This was not an isolated incident. The scene was replicated in cities and towns across the country. Foreclosed and abandoned dwellings littered urban and suburban neighborhoods, further driving down already depressed home values. And many of the former occupants of the now empty spaces were being pushed into poverty. Durbin addressed the few colleagues assembled in the Senate chamber that morning, and the cable news cameras arguing for a change in the law to respond to the collapse of home prices and the related foreclosure crisis. When Durbin spoke, millions of underwater homeowners owed more on their mortgages than their houses were worth. Millions more faced foreclosure. In an attempt to prevent defaults and foreclosures, Durbin hoped to give bankruptcy court judges the power to reduce the balance owed on a residential mortgage to the home's market value. The House of Representatives had already passed a bill to that effect. Durbin hoped that the Senate would do the same, but the bill then moving through the Senate, called the Helping Families Save Their Homes Act, did not yet contain language pertaining to mortgage modification through bankruptcy. Thus, he proposed his amendment. The purpose of the House bill and the Durbin Amendment was to solve the problem created by Nobleman versus American Savings Bank, to restore mortgage modification rights for homeowners. The Durbin Amendment included a shared appreciation provision. While homeowners could reduce principal to current deflated market values, they would also have to share the gain in value with the lender upon later sale. The Congressional Budget Office determined that more than 1 million homeowners would benefit from the legislation and that the bankruptcy reform measure would cost the taxpayers nothing. This was not the first time Durbin sought this reform. A year earlier, after the mortgage crisis was well underway, he introduced a similar bill. After Durbin and others finished speaking, the Senate would be voting. In the months leading up to the day of the Senate vote, other than Citibank, the largest banks fought the proposal. 60 different financial service, insurance, and real estate firms spent $42 million on lobbyists in the first quarter of 2009 to help block the bankruptcy reform measure. The biggest spender by far, at $5.7 million, was a National Association of Realtors, whose chief economist had, near the peak of the bubble, published a book entitled "Why the Real Estate Boom Will Not Bust and How You Can Profit from It." The book's cover featured a family standing inside of a picket fence lawn, gazing up at a small home levitating in the air. Industry opponents loudly predicted the perils that would follow should principal reduction through bankruptcy be allowed again. None of their arguments, though, were persuasive. Okay, and the last thing I'm reading to you from here, because this is the key. So there had been other programs that were underway, and one was called the HAMP. And the HAMP was designed to allow, to encourage banks to voluntarily restructure mortgage loans. And there was also another program through the Department of Housing and Urban Development that was originally projected to reach 1.5 million households, but by the end of 2011, only 646 homeowners had been helped by HUD. So there are other programs that were just either voluntary or didn't require a principal reduction, and they were not that effective. But let's talk about where the NV comes from. So when the HAMP was announced, this is a program of encouraging people to restructure mortgages with interest rates, but not really reduce principal. When the HAMP was announced in February 2009, there was immediate backlash. CNBC on-air editor Rick Santelli appeared on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and began to rage. Santelli, a former derivatives trader, shouted that, quote, "The government is promoting bad behavior, and there should be a public vote on whether we want to subsidize the losers' mortgages." He shouted, "This is America? How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills?" Raised their hands. This sentiment helped doom the bankruptcy reform legislation that would have cost taxpayers nothing. Santelli added, "We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing." One last bit here. Santelli's rant, which was rebroadcast widely, played into our worst emotions, and it became a rallying cry for the Tea Party movement. It was filled with misplaced blame and steeped in envy. It lacked reason and historical context. It was okay to short someone's house through credit derivatives, commit trillions of dollars to rescue the banking system, and fail to prosecute the top bankers who facilitated the fraud, but not to help save other people's houses. Yet, if foreclosures were stemmed, the value of our own homes would be protected, our neighborhoods made safer, and public services and private sector jobs maintained. Reading these words now, 11 years, what is it, 11 years after Dodd-Frank, actually 11 years after this vote, 12 years after this vote, 11 years after Dodd-Frank, is distressing because it is that attitude, I believe, that still prevents us from dealing with the problem in housing, equal opportunity in housing discrimination, lending discrimination, and so on. Okay. So some good news, though, and I'm about to wrap things up. I know that we started 1:15, but I think I've got a few more minutes. So during COVID, during the coronavirus pandemic, when it became clear, when the first announcements were made, I think in mid-March of 2020, when the whole country kind of shut down, right? The first times when people were, when New York City shut down restaurants, when the whole country pretty much, I don't think there was any state that didn't do some kind of shutdown of some businesses, at least. When that started to happen, employment dropped off immediately, businesses shut down. It was clear at that point that there was going to have to be an intervention when it came to housing. And happily enough, there was. I think the silver lining here is that the administration at the time in Congress understood the emergency. And we ended up with the ability for people to have forbearance on their mortgages. We had funding available, although it's not, as I asked in the question session after the first panel, it's not, there wasn't an infrastructure in place to help distribute the funding at the state and local level for people to stay, renters to stay in their homes. And sometimes landlords want to use any kind of rent default to evict a tenant, and then maybe charge, especially a month-to-month tenant, and then they can maybe charge additional rent, who knows? But infrastructure, lack of incentives are real issues. Now, there's also problems, right, at the Supreme Court. Over the summer, the Supreme Court decided that that the attempt to extend the foreclosure moratorium that was done by the CDC was not legitimate, and it would have to be done by Congress. I don't think that the CDC attempt was bad, though, because at least it's staved off foreclosures for a little bit. But here was, again, silver lining. Even though states and the federal government need to actually have legislative action before they make these changes, you have, for the city of New York, we now, or I should say for the state of New York, we have Kathy Hochul saying, I'm going to do something about this, right? We have local actors extending on the moratoria, the state and local level, in using the authority that they have. Similarly, again, because this is perceived as an emergency, in many towns, including mine in this country, given that we had a deadly pandemic, one of the most vulnerable populations for themselves are people who are homeless, also people in prisons who we did very little to help protect. But in my town, the concern, I think, about homeless people was maybe for their own sake, but maybe for the broader community. And because our schools were shut down, our high school was transformed into a homeless shelter temporarily during the COVID crisis. What does this bring me all to? Why, even though our actions when it's emergency conditions have not always been as good as they can be, it's only emergency conditions that get people looking around and saying they're willing to try to help people who are either homeless, on the verge of eviction, or cannot pay their mortgage. And I would say anytime we have 500,000 people who are homeless, anytime we have people struggling to get by, worried about mortgage debt, not being able to move for jobs because they're underwater, all the things people face right now about affordability of housing, this is an emergency. And I think we need to think more creatively. And the homelessness piece, as David mentioned earlier, it's much more complicated because it's housing, it's mental health, it's drug rehabilitation facilities, it's training for jobs, or deciding that people maybe need help, disability payments, and so on. But there's more. And I want to, my last comment here is, when I say think holistically, I want you to think about this fact about taxes. Right now in America, I'm sure you've seen that the median amount to rent a one-bedroom apartment in America is a little over $1,200 a month. Now, I know a lot of you might be shocked because you probably think you can't even find a one-bedroom apartment for $1,200 a month, but that's the median cost. So $1,200 a month is about $14,000, a little over $14,000 a year. That's basic math. I know you probably thought there'd be no math, but it's a little bit of math. Okay, so that's what it costs just to pay your rent, minimum, just to have shelter for a one-bedroom apartment on average. And yet, the standard deduction for a single person, deduction meaning the tax-free amount, the amount, although money is withheld from your paycheck, the amount that you're allowed to have as a deduction is a little over $12,400 a year. What that's saying is that even before you bring in, and I'm not even talking about state, local, or other, FICA, but even before you bring in enough money in this country to be able to get shelter for yourself, Uncle Sam is reaching into your paycheck and taking income tax out. That's outrageous. That's outrageous. And it shouldn't even be that. But what is, so I am, my next foray, as I mentioned to you, I'm hardly a housing or equal opportunity specialist. I'm thinking about the ways in which holistically this works together. So I am now working on tax policy, not just taxing the rich, right? Not just wearing the dress to the gala, not just wealth tax. All those things are important, but we need to ease the tax burden, not just on the deserving poor, but I believe on the working, middle, and actually upper middle class, because I think it does impact our ability to stay in our homes, to pay our mortgages and pay our rents, and survive in this society. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. I should ask, are there any questions, right?
I'll ask a quick question. I feel bad. It's my radio silence phobia again. I'm just wondering what's going on. So I really like your focus on the middle income group. And I think it's an interesting thing politically. Do you feel that maybe the focus on the very lowest income and most economically needy people has enabled there to be manipulation of people who are middle income in the country, where they are actually acting against their own interests in order to feather the nests of people at the very top? And if you could give a couple examples of that, that'd be really great. I know we don't have a ton of time, but.
Yeah, I mean, that was a leading question, but yes, I mean, I think it's this whole emphasis on means testing, right? We could spend more time making sure no one gets an undeserving nickel. The best example I can think of is, whether it's student loan forgiveness, and you just hear people who have so much pride, like, well, I don't think I should get that because I can afford X, Y, or Z. It's the others who can't afford it. And you're just like, all the othering, it's a mistake. It's kind of like, it reminds me, here's another, analogy. You go use the subway in New York or Boston, you just buy a ticket. In DC, you've got to stand at a machine. I mean, if you live in DC, you probably know all your routes, but if you're not from there, you stand at a machine, because God forbid in DC, anyone pays to travel too far. It doesn't pay enough to travel far enough. Like, I'm only going, one stop, so I'm going to pay less than someone that goes 5 stops. And that whole mentality, it's an inconvenience. And I think that whole means testing mentality, I don't think it initially designed to play into the envy, but I think it ends up being divisive. There was a time, another example is higher education was free in my lifetime in California, for example. Make it free everywhere. It is part of it comes out of an idea of scarcity. I mean, I could go on to Stephanie Kelton's whole MMT idea about how we can actually afford all of this. But there's so much abundance in the society. It would be better if we had free higher ed, not all these sliding scales, not all these forms to fill out. And then if public option is free, private option, pay what you want, and let the schools, if they want people who can't afford it, to reach into their endowments. But that was what I'd say. I see David's hand up.
Yeah, David, if you could make this just the last question so we can give folks a break before the start of the afternoon panel. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm just thinking along the same lines of Andrea. One of the big differences, I think, in the Great Depression and in the Great Recession of the 2000s is that the pain was felt so broadly across the country, and that it wasn't limited to the coasts or the sand states or anything, but really homeowners everywhere were suffering, and HALT came in and cleared up all those problems throughout the country. And then a big difference with the financial crisis of 2008 is that it was really localized to the sand states and to the coasts. If you have a crisis like that, how can you convince the broad electorate to kind of share the pain? Is there a way to do that, or is it just going to be very natural for people to say, well, those people were irresponsible? So I guess you've identified the problem, but is there any political solution to to a problem when the pain is not equally distributed.
Yeah, I love that. It's too late if we're waiting for the emergency, right? It's too late, you know, when it's the hurricane. So I think the best political solutions are, you know, popular culture solutions. It's getting into the, you know, we've got to change the mindset. And, you know, 20 years ago, I would have said, you know, good movies about this topic, getting people to, but now, you know, we've got Twitter and we've got all kinds of independent propaganda sources. And it's really hard to change the mindset to try to get us to understand how interconnected we are. I see Judith disagreeing, but okay, wait, I want to hear a disagreement. But I think we've got to work now on the mindset, right? Like restructuring the conversation, not that, you know, everything is fine and we just had, you know, COVID, or we just had, you know, there's problems in the labor market already. There's all these, you know, what can we do right now to say where we could be with the American dream, where we could be with a shared prosperity, is it where we are now? And changing the conversation. And I don't know, people don't pay attention to conversations, but I'm hoping there might be a way in popular culture with young people to get people to say more, to see themselves as more interconnected. And maybe that's through existing infrastructure like labor unions or church groups. But we've got to think about what infrastructure has always been there and how do we talk to each other across regions. And I think, David, that plays to all the other problems we're having in the society as well. But Judith, I didn't get to see your comments. Do you want to say out loud why you disagree?
Well, I just disagreed with the notion that it was the foreclosure crisis was a coastal issue. Actually, the Midwest and the Rust Belt states started earlier, continued longer, and have recovered more slowly. I think the issue does come back to that real psychological, and there's been a lot of research by social scientists and psychologists on this notion of the deserving poor. And time after time again, we find that people are willing to help people they perceive to have not done anything wrong, but not those they perceive somehow have done something wrong. And I think that's what we have to change. We have to change the narrative that somehow people are responsible for, you know, the financial crisis, for instance, or COVID.
Right. I mean, but you, right. No, I mean, I agree with you. And I you know, I guess, well, I'm glad that we're kind of all on the same page on that. And it ends up being a nice idea about how do you do it. And I try to do it everything. Like, that's why I write. That's why when I have a choice, I write a book for a trade press and not a law journal article. That's why I'm never going to get a job at a top tier law school. But, you know, we make our choices, you know, like I do things that are, I think, in the interest of the public instead of doing things that are in the interest of our own personal career. But, you know, I don't know if I'm making a difference. You know, we need to get to people who are real influencers. And I do think that's, you know, that's still Hollywood. I think that's still like Morning Joe, right? It's still trying to get these messages to people who can get them out to millions of people, the people who shape public opinion. And it's hard because when the sponsors of the people who shape public opinion don't want to hear the message, it's not getting out there, you know?
Okay, I think we could probably easily go on with this topic throughout the afternoon, but let's try and give everybody about a 5-minute break, and we will start the afternoon panel right at 1:15. You want to just enjoy kind of 5 minutes to stretch your legs, and we'll get started. Thank you.